I was about to say good afternoon, but it's not the afternoon quite yet. It's interesting how people distribute themselves. Sorry, it just struck me that you're all over there and not many people right here. But so welcome everyone. I'm Jennifer Dill. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning and director of TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center that helps organize this Friday's seminar. In the fall, as many of you know, this is also a class that is offered. So my colleagues, Professor Li-Ming Wang and Professor Chris Monsieur, who's not here quite yet, are the instructors this term. And normally one of them would be doing the introduction. But I am taking the opportunity to introduce our speaker today, who I invited here to join us, and that is Dr. David Berrigan. He is at the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, and he's been a biologist in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences since 2003. And in 2015, within there, he joined the Health Behaviors Research branch, which gives you a hint of the type of research he's going to be talking about today. He has a bit of a Northwest connection. He is a graduate of Reed College just across the river, and he spent some time as a postdoc and lecturer at the University of Washington. So welcome, David. We're very happy to have you here.
Thanks, Jennifer. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here, and it was a real sentimental journey, as it always is, to come back to Portland, which has definitely changed a little since 1979, when, no offense, it was a bit of a mess as a city, actually. But of course, most of you weren't even born then, so take my word for it. Jennifer has been an inspiration to me, and so it's really great that she invited me here, and we collaborated on some projects a number of years ago, and she was really patient and generous, since I was trained as a fruit fly biologist, and have just gradually been trying to work my way into the field of cancer prevention and control, and analysis of health behaviors, transportation, and physical activity. And so it's only through various colleagues that I've been able to, I think, learn some things and try to support research in this area that seems so important to healthy and happy communities and to cancer prevention. And so this is a bit of a whirlwind tour kind of talk, hopefully showing you a few ideas and then just highlighting a real smorgasbord of activities that are arising from my division and from our collaboration with the Centers for Disease Control. So I'll talk a little bit about why on earth the National Cancer Institute is doing work on walking and physical activity. I'll tell you a little about where I'm coming from to sort of place me in the government sector. And then we do a lot of work on surveillance and generating data. And so I'll talk about results from the National Health Interview Survey, and briefly allude to other data sources. So one of the main take-homes here is there's a lot of data resources out there that in transportation you might not be as familiar with, but offer opportunities for analyses. And I'll make this point several times, but every thesis, master's or PhD, should have a chapter that involves analysis of salient federal data resources as a way to set the stage for your work. So I urge you all to do that. Then I'll tell you about some measurement and tools that I've helped develop, and a few remarks about funding opportunities, emerging research, and convening that I've been helping with over in the past year or so. So first of all, lack of physical activity is a risk factor for cancer at multiple sites, and for mortality, sedentary time, light, moderate, and vigorous physical activity all matter. There's an emerging perspective that attention is needed to the whole 24-hour cycle of behavior because our activities are not independent of each other. And finally, walking is an important target for health promotion and cancer prevention. So I'll show you a couple of relevant facts related to this argument, and this sets the stage for why NCI lets me do this kind of work. As you know, the physical activity guidelines, second edition, were updated and released in 2018. And part of this physical activity guideline update included extensive review of the existing literature on physical activity and health. And physically active adults have a significantly lower risk of developing several commonly occurring cancers: bladder, breast, colon, endometrium, esophagus, kidney, lung, and the stomach. And so this evidence, based largely on epidemiological studies and on work in animal models, has become so compelling. Do you need me to pause for a moment?
Sorry.
Yeah, they're not getting your sound.
I'll do a brief interpretive dance and then we'll resume the conversation. Okay, should I resume or?
Yes, let's give this a try. We'll check another audience.
The mic is definitely on.
Yes, the mic is on.
Testing.
Go ahead and say hello.
Hello, testing. Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, 2nd edition. Hundreds of pages and about 1,000-page background evidence report. Key take-home message: move more, sit a bit less. The first part of that recommendation is more strongly supported than the second. As I said, this evidence linking lack of physical activity to increased risk of cancer has become so compelling that my division and the NCI are devoting significant research resources to physical activity as one of the leading modifiable risk factors for cancer. That's okay. What?
Sorry, I'm so frustrated.
Tech is hard. I had a meeting yesterday with some people. Permanente's brand new that's good.
Let's give it another try.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, no, that's fine. It just
Oh, it's working now. Yay, we're on.
Right.
okay, excellent.
Thank you, guys.
So if you can just close what you need to, and then click on that window so I can advance. Yeah, so a further recent review honing in on the population attributable fraction of cancers caused by modifiable risk factors is shown here. So here's the percent of cancers that could be prevented because they're caused by behavioral factors or exposures or infection that we could avoid. This is a paper by Islami et al. 2018 from the American Cancer Society, so highly reputable. And what you can see here for women, physical activity is the number 4 modifiable risk factor after cigarette smoking, excess body weight, alcohol consumption, and then physical inactivity. So this kind of result is highly motivating for the Institute to try to invest work in prevention. And for men, the attributable fraction is only about 1.4%. So perhaps we should be emphasizing increasing physical activity in women because it's a leading factor there. And we are also, this is an aside, but for a long time in the US, unlike in the UK and in Australia, we've really neglected alcohol as a risk factor for cancer. But there's an emerging body of evidence suggesting that alcohol is showing that alcohol is a risk factor for cancer at multiple sites. And even though most people only drink moderately, many people drink moderately, and so a small increase in risk can create a large public health problem. So I think alcohol is next on our agenda, and there's probably some intersections between problems with alcohol and transportation and the public health challenge of cancer prevention. So there might be synergies there going forward in public health. In a recent meta-analysis and review of studies of mortality and objectively measured physical activity carried out by Eklund et al., and including a number of papers that I helped with, so I'm proud of that the body of evidence has emerged. You can see that there's been 8 studies to date linking mortality and this device-based measurement of physical activity. And the results are emerging that there are substantial benefits to light activity as well as moderate and vigorous physical activity. So this is incredibly important because not everyone can sort of get organized enough to achieve moderate and vigorous physical activity levels. But light activity, walking, light housework, that sort of thing, has substantial health benefits. You can see that in the top right-hand panel, whereas as you move as you have lower and lower levels of light physical activity, you have much higher risk of all-cause mortality. So I think this is especially important in the transportation sector because a lot of walking is not necessarily reaching the level of moderate or vigorous activity. You know, purposeful walking, brisk walking is moderate, but a lot of walking you see on the street doesn't appear to be achieving that level. But that light intensity walking is showing substantial benefits in a population. So I'm really excited about that. And additionally, you see here increased risk associated with sedentary time, especially after about 9 hours of sedentary time per day. And so this sort of supports the argument I was making earlier about how we need to pay attention to the whole 24 hours, because you have sleep, sedentary time, and activity. And if you change activity or sleep duration in any one of those things, you're simultaneously substituting for some other form of activity. So we need to make sense of the whole day, not just say, add 2 more hours of X, Y, or Z. I may come back to this later, but again, I want to highlight how we need multiple disciplines at the table. This is a time budget from a behavioral scientist, and it's notable. Well, I wanted to make a few points here. Time spent in activities is correlated, as I just said, and physical activity from multiple activities, light, moderate, and vigorous, can add up to benefit health. So this suggests we might need a more holistic approach to data collection. And this issue also inspires the use of 24-hour recalls or devices for measurement, because it's hard to remember everything you did, all different kinds of activities over the past week, month, or year. But a device can measure activities over the whole 24 hours, and we can often remember yesterday, even if we can't remember on average what we did last month. But one of the things I wanted to highlight with this little graph is we need a lot of different disciplines at the table, because you'll notice this person's day, they have studying, hobbies, sleep, breakfast, yoga, work, lunch, more work, and dinner, but they don't seem to have gone anywhere. And surely, I mean, maybe they just did all this in their little studio apartment, but most people have some transportation in every day. So I thought that really jumped out at me. And so, you know, this is my story and I'm sticking to it. Walking is an important public health target and an important target for the National Cancer Institute. The journey to better health begins with a single step. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy said that in 2015. And, you know, clearly Mr. Natural looks happy too. So, and I'm not sure about his health status. I do detect, I don't want to profile, but there may be a BMI issue here. Okay, so part 2, where I'm from. I'm from the Health Behavior Research Branch in the Behavioral Research Program of the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the National Cancer Institute, in the National Institutes of Health, in the Department of Health and Human Services. So FYI. And our vision is a world in which individuals, families, and communities engage in healthy lifestyle behaviors to prevent cancer, improve treatment outcomes, extend life, and optimize health and well-being. We support research at multiple levels, and we look at all different levels: biologic, psychological, behavioral, social, environmental, policy, individually, and in combination. And our purview includes cancer-related behavioral risk factors of interest and genetics. So diet, other emerging behaviors, physical activity, energy balance, obesity, alcohol use, sleep and circadian dysfunction, adherence to cancer-related medical and behavioral regimes, sun safety, and tanning. And these circled ones you can see are directly relevant to behaviors associated with active transportation. And we take kind of a multi-level translational approach using this sort of framework where we have levels of influence, policy, the physical environment, the social, psychological, and behavioral environment. We look across the translational continuum, and we are interested in cancer control from prevention, detection, treatment, and in survivors. And so, you know, a lot of my work is on the front, top left facing quadrant of this, looking at policy and the physical environment and how those are related to health behaviors, often in you know, the epidemiological and evaluation component. So our branch has a branch chief and 4 program directors. So you can imagine it's fantastic that we get to do this work on primary prevention, health behaviors, but clearly when you think of the dimensionality of the problem we're trying to address, we only have expertise in a modest number of those areas. And it's, you know, you have to look beyond the Cancer Institute to other elements of NIH, like the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the Diabetes Institute, Children Health and Development, the National Institute of Aging, to sort of fill out this program of investigating health behaviors. Okay, so the third part of this talk, now I want to talk about a little bit of actual science results and analyses. And it was sort of fun preparing this because I suddenly realized my whole career at NIH has been just all about walking in some ways. And I never expected that to happen. Even though I had done research on fruit flies, where I measured the energetic costs of locomotion in fruit flies and the costs of crawling in the larval fruit flies. So actually I was already a kind of physical activity physiologist, but it took me years to make the connection between, you know, my old career and my new one. So this work I'm going to talk about involves surveillance and data collection about walking and walkability in the National Health Interview Survey. So the National Health Interview Survey is a large, nationally representative health survey administered by in-person interview. And the interviewers speak to the people in 35,000 households per year, plus or minus. In 2005, 2010, and 2015, the cancer control supplement of the survey that my office funds included questions about transportation and leisure walking. And I was part of the team that helped invent these questions in 2003 and 4 when I first joined NCI. And so we put the questions in the survey, and then I just sit around for 5 years, and then we get some more data. Surveillance of slowly evolving characteristics takes a lot of patience, right? And I think there's a lot of similarities with transportation or housing or what have you, where, you know, things take a long time to happen. And in 2015, we got to include a module of questions about walkability, about perceptions of the environment for walking. I'll show you those in a minute. Those modules were developed in collaboration with Heather Bowles and myself at NCI, with staff from CDC, Janet Fulton, Kathy Watson, Susan Carlson, Jeff Whitfield, Emily Ussery, and more. And some outside experts advised us, Mark Adams, Ross Bronson, and Peter James. Enthusiasm about the module so far is high because of the importance of walking to CDC priorities. And so we're going to continue to keep these in the survey for a few more cycles. I'll tell you a little more about that. But I think it's so amazing that we can get this, you know, perceptions of the environment as a key part of the US National Health Interview Survey. It's an incredible change from 15 years ago when, you know, I can't imagine this going forward. Just the timeline here, as I alluded to, 2005, 2015, in 2020, these questions will be fielded again. And I wanted to mention that questions about walking for leisure and transportation have been in the California Health Interview Survey, a similarly large survey with many common questions to the National Health Interview Survey from 2003 to 2017, and they will be fielded again. And so these two surveys combined are a rich resource for further analyses. There have been a number of papers, and I'll tell you about some of our papers, but there are many more dimensions of walking that could be addressed in these surveys. So get out there, download the data, carefully analyze it using appropriate statistical methods that Carlos can help you with, and disseminate more important information about this material. The walking questions, very similar in two domains for transportation and leisure, and they're phrased in this format. The next questions are about walking for transportation. I will ask you separately about walking for other reasons like relaxation and exercise. During the past 7 days, did you walk to get someplace that took you at least 10 minutes? In the past 7 days, how many times did you do that? How long did that walk take? And on average, how long did those walks take? So a couple of things to note about this. One is I mentioned earlier that recall is a problem. We're asking about the past week. So this is kind of an average, a gestalt of the person's past walks, and is probably most salient to longer structured walks that have some cognitive characteristics that allow you to remember them. So if every morning you wake up and have breakfast and take a half-hour walk or a 10-minute walk to the bus stop or to your office, pretty easy to say, oh yeah, I take 2 walks a day and I did it 5 times last week. But if you have a lot of intermittent bouts, it can be harder to capture that. So that's just a measurement feature here. And then the other point is the 10-minute interval. And that arises because past physical activity guidelines suggested that physical activity should occur in 10-minute bouts. The new guidelines suggest that every minute counts based on some reanalyses of various health surveys based on accelerometry data. And so in the next cycle of the survey, we're taking out the 10-minute requirement. So it'll be really interesting to see if there are dramatic changes in the amount of walking reported. We've kind of tested that in some other surveys on convenience samples, and it looks like it doesn't make that much difference, perhaps because of the measurement characteristics of these standardized surveys. But it's a problem. You want to do surveillance on public health relevant behavioral characteristics, and if those change, then your capacity to track behavior can change. The walkability questions, we were able to put in 11 questions about perceptions of the environment. How often are there people walking within sight of your home? How often does the weather make you less likely to walk? And then a series of yes/no questions about destinations and barriers to walking. So these questions are kind of a screener for different factors that might influence walking. There are questionnaires about the neighborhood environment for walking that have 50 or 60 questions in them, but we weren't allowed to take up that much time. So we had to sort of deal with the pesky problem of, do we want to ask only about one thing in detail or try to get a broad picture? So we chose the broad picture for good or ill. So I'm going to spend the next 7 hours telling you in enormous detail about these 12 papers that I've written, that I've helped write with the CDC team. No, I'm going to give you a few highlights, and you can download these slides, get these papers, and everything will be on the test. But I think it's interesting to look at this series of papers, and they're a model for careful and logical reporting about a complex survey. I mostly help them by nagging about potential interactions between perceived and measured environments and about the limitations of self-report. We're just getting there in our future analyses, but the CDC team is highly focused on papers that have a single overriding communication objective and which can help lead to public health action. So it's been neat seeing their approach to analyzing survey data analysis, as opposed to my approach, which is often to put in all the variables and try to figure out really complicated models that simultaneously address every single variable and covariate. Many of those papers take a long time to publish because they're extremely confusing and stuff. So this SOCO approach, I think, has a lot of merit to try to teach people. So what are some of the highlights of these results? Well, first of all, self-report of walking increased from 2005 to 2015. You can see a sharper increase from 2005 to 2010, and then a more modest increase from 2010 to 2015 for both men and women, and for both transportation and leisure. So as I've stared at this graph for a long time, you know, I think the biggest question about it is how much of this is a real change in walking behavior, and how much of it reflects a change in the social desirability bias. So over this time, there's been more and more fuss about lack of physical activity and how walking is good for you. And so another interpretation of these increases is that people are like, oh, walking is good for me, I should try harder to report some of it or remember it, or just, you know, there's an unconscious tendency maybe to slightly increase the estimate of last week's walking. So that's an unanswered question here, that mix of the contributions of bias and a real change in behavior. And I think that sort of concern has led to a big push towards more use of accelerometers and pedometers and Fitbits and what have you to measure physical activity. But we don't yet have a surveillance system that has incorporated that device-based measurement over time to try to tease apart this measurement issue. Because of the size of the survey, we're able to do a little bit of mapping, in this case at the state and regional level. And you can see here any walking. People are more likely to report walking on the West Coast, in a few states, Minnesota and Colorado, and in the Northeast. And, you know, thought-provokingly, much less walking in some of the regions where the obesity epidemic is most serious in the Southeast. And these patterns are pretty similar for leisure, and both leisure walking and for transportation walking. A little bit different, I think, perhaps not surprisingly, the transportation walking shows up a bit more in the Northeast, and in California and Washington, probably reflecting a few of the major urban areas there as opposed to the states as a whole. So destinations seem to differ and matter. Younger, male, white, Western people report more destination types from among shops, bus and transit stops, movies, and places to relax. And so it's a little high dimensional here, but one of the things that really jumped out at me is if you look on the far right at the census region and contrast the South and the West, so many more people in the West report 3 to 4 destination types than in the South. So that might be something to think about from a planning and land use perspective. Is this a perception of the environment, or is this a reality of the environment that people live around, that destinations are distributed in relation to where people live? And we have some analysis plans along those lines, but I think smarter people could do better than we could with some studies contrasting perceptions and objective characteristics of the environment. And you can do spatial linkage at a finer geographic scale with these data, but you have to do it at the Research Data Center in Hyattsville, Maryland. So come visit me, you can stay in our basement, it'll be great. So barriers, we took a look at different census regions and at urban-rural differences in barriers. There were subtle differences, but the main signal that seemed to pop out is that crime and dogs are perceived barriers to walking for race, ethnic groups other than non-Hispanic whites. So I think that's kind of very thought-provoking, is what are the characteristics of people's neighborhoods that are influencing these differential perceptions? And, you know, what's the best strategy to address those differences? You know, is it a matter of understanding your neighborhood, or is it a fact that, you know, dogs are a menace in some neighborhoods rather than others? And how is that distributed over the country? This sort of survey data can inspire us to delve in more deeply. Now I'm going to talk about 2 papers and just that are in various stages slightly before submission. And so I won't show you too many results, but these are sort of finally getting to the exciting parts. So it's like a sneak preview, and hopefully they'll all be accepted in the coming year or 2 or 3. And the first one is about the relationship between self-reported walking and the National Walkability Index, an EPA measure of whether environments are walkable. And the second one, starting to explore weather as a barrier to walking, where we're just starting now to try to contrast kind of physical reality, the actual weather in places, and psychological reality, your perceptions, people's perceptions of the environment. Sometimes people talk about those things as subjective and objective, but I don't like that distinction, because my perception of the environment is not subjective, it's a real thing for me. So I feel like when you talk about subjective versus objective, you're downplaying the person and their lived experience and playing up, you know, the technocrat's capacity to measure things. So I'd like to put those on more equal footing, but it's hard to figure out the right vocabulary for that. So my idea just now is psychological reality and physical reality. So I'm going to see if I can get that to catch on. Maybe Carlos will blog about it. So the National Walkability Index, in this project, we examine associations between self-reported walking and this EPA Walkability Index I mentioned. The index elements included design, distance to transit, and land use mix, diversity of the land use. Index scores were linked to the NHIS based on respondents' block groups, sorry I left that out, and classified into least, below average, above average, and most walkable communities. Linkage, as I said, was at the RDC. Actually, there's an RDC site in Atlanta. So my CDC collaborators don't have to come to Hyattsville, sadly, but they can just, you know, go down the street and do it. So that's helped with the speeding up the analyses. And we use regression models. We had an urban-rural residence variable from the Census Bureau. And the index ranks the block groups according to their relative walkability with intersection density, proximity to transit stops, and a mix of employment and household type data. And this is the first study, I think, of ours that has actually looked to sort of examine the construct validity of this index with behavioral data. And it's neat, there are other walkability indexes based on census data, but this one is appealing in different ways. It's going to be updated in January. It's freely downloadable. And in some smaller studies, it showed some promise. You'll have to download the slides and you can read some of the variable descriptions here. And if you go to their website, it's even more poorly organized than the National Cancer Institute website. But with some patience, you'll find all the different pieces. And here's just a map in Austin showing you how, you know, the least walkable, below average, above average, and most walkable neighborhoods sort of sort themselves out. The center of town is more walkable and what have you. I'll share these slides too, so you don't have to take a picture, but you're welcome to, of course. Oh, you're tweeting. Oh, I forgot about modern times. And why did we use Austin? I think one of my colleagues really wants to move back there. So this is, so anyway, so I'm not showing you the results, but this paper will be submitted next week, and it'll be accepted eventually. But what we saw was a strong positive correlation between reported walking and the EPA Walkability Index in urban areas, and a weak correlation between leisure walking and the index in, oh, I'm sorry, a typo, also in urban areas. So what's happening is this measure is about kind of destinations and land use mix. So it makes sense in urban areas, but it really doesn't have anything to do with walking in the country, partly because there's nowhere to walk to, and partly because the factors maybe that influence walking are totally different. They involve, you know, what the landscape, the topography is like, recreational paths, things like that. So this seems to be a, you know, really good for the face validity of the index, and a reminder that maybe we need a bit more work in rural areas to try to characterize rural environments. And you know, the US is 80% of the people live in urban areas, but that other 20% matters. And I grew up in the country too, so I think it's a worthwhile demographic. You heard it here first. And the mean minutes of walking show similar relationships. And send me, if you're keen on this area, send me an email and I'll put you on my list of people to share the paper with as soon as Kathy gets it together and gets it published. So as I said, the EPA Walkability Index is a useful measure for making sense of transportation walking in urban areas. It's a good covariate for studies of other causes of walking. It could be a guide for planning. You'd have to look in more detail at the variable, and it highlights the need for measures of environmental influences on walking in rural areas and for leisure walking more generally. So our next analyses are going to be combined regression models looking at the walkability index and perceptions of the environment and how they combine to influence self-reported walking. We'll focus probably on the transportation walking in the urban areas, since that's where the index seems to matter. And I'm really excited about that, because I think a number of past studies on idiosyncratic samples have suggested that both psychological reality and physical reality matter. And I think we need more studies trying to tease apart the contributions of those two different pieces and deciding what we should target in interventions. The last project that we're working on right this minute concerns weather as a barrier to walking. Susan Carlson so far has been thinking about the perceptions of weather as a barrier, and then she's downloaded a bunch of data about average temperature at the county level and has done some modeling how those factors interact to influence walking along with our other covariates. So far reporting weather as a barrier to walking was associated with lower prevalence and duration of walking, and higher temperatures and perceptions of the weather as a barrier to walking showed some weak interactions in their association with leisure walking only. So these results were encouraging to us, and then we had a few phone calls and started to talk, and we realized that we'd slightly forgotten that humidity might matter. And I think maybe it's because we just take it for granted that it's horribly humid everywhere since we were in Atlanta and Washington, D.C. So the data resource we're using for the average temperature also has the dew point, and so we're going to calculate a humidity or comfort index and incorporate that in our analyses. So yeah, we were a little embarrassed at that oversight, but and we should get to that really soon. Although, I mean, in thinking about the CDC, it was kind of neat that our colleague Jeff Whitfield, who's doing the analysis, had to stop doing it because he was called away and detailed to the CDC lung disease response team to address the vaping epidemic and this outbreak of morbidity and mortality associated with vaping. So that's sort of a neat thing about CDC, is they're not just analyzing chronic disease over long time scales, but they get to address these other kind of public health issues. So we're waiting for Jeff to solve that problem and come back to the important things. I won't go into this whole graph in detail, but the National Health Interview Survey just in the past couple of years had a redesign. And so it's going to be asking its various questions on the somewhat different cycle. But I was super gratified that the walking questions have been moved to the core of the survey, so we don't have to pay for them anymore. And they're going to keep the walkability questions. So for at least until 2027, every 3 years, we'll have questions about walking and walkability. So, the long, slow process of surveillance of environmental changes at this scale and behavior will continue a bit, and we can keep using it as grist to try to help inform communities about topics that they might address to promote health through walking. Some more walking-related papers and data resources. We funded the FLASHY study of adolescent parent dyads with extensive data on physical activity, notably walking behavior in kids in relation to school. My postdoc Lillian Perez has a paper about that. And then I think that is a really interesting thing, because we imagine in children, it's their relationship to their parents that might influence their behavioral choices, and kids might influence parents too. So the purposes of that study was try to delve into that, and quite a bit of publication has taken place there. But again, there's still more room for subgroup analyses and for novel questions. There's They filled out a lot of questionnaires, so there's different ways to slice that up to try to get some insight that could inspire some more on the ground or local work. My other postdoc, Calvin Tribby, is looking at interactions between physical activity, walking, sunburn, and sun protective behaviors. He's kind of developing this idea that sometimes there might be trade-offs between different behaviors. So we're recommending physical activity and walking because it's good for you, but a lot of that takes place outside and exposes you to risks associated with sunburn. Obviously, that's not such an issue here in Portland, but nationwide, it's a problem. And something I really think more people should do is the National Health Interview Survey has a mortality linkage. So everyone in the survey from 1986 to 2014 was linked to the mortality index. So we know if they lived or died and what they died of. So you can kind of do that to explore associations between self-reported behavior and mortality. And I think there's room for some papers like that with the walking and mortality. The linkage is till December 31st, 2015. My CDC colleagues are saying, oh, maybe we should wait, but there's still been, from 2005 to 2015 is 10 years of follow-up. I've seen studies where there were only 2 years of follow-up and they wrote lots of papers. So a project idea for somebody. I'll try not to go a little bit longer. Part 4, measurement and tools. I want to talk about 3 things that I've helped with that are tools that might be of interest and resources for learning and analysis. The National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research, physical activities completed over time in 24 hours. This is a measurement tool, the ACT 24-hour measurement tool, and then some work on MET score linkage and resources related to that. These are a little geeky, so you could check your phones if it seems too much to you, but I'm so proud of the fact that I've been able to help with this kind of work for my NCI platform that I like to share about them. And this might be useful to the faculty as much as to the students. So the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research is a collaborative between NIH, the US Department of Agriculture, the Centers for Disease Control, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we wrote some grants and got some money from the JPB Foundation as well. And we've been trying to develop measurement resources to improve measurement of diet, physical activity, and the environments that influence those determinants of childhood obesity. And we've created a series of resources, and these have a lot in them that's relevant to adults as well as children, despite the emphasis on children. So we have 3 things: a searchable registry of measures of physical activity, diet, and the environment. And that consists of a compilation of over 1,000 papers that we've abstracted and characterized that present validation studies of different tools for measuring behavior and environments. So it's a great place to start to think about tools that you might need for your projects, and a little more structured and with a little more information than just going to PubMed, where if you search for childhood obesity and physical activity, you might find 30,000 articles. The second resource that I think could be really useful for teaching and for new investigators and what have you are a series of 4 monograph-length guides written by world famous experts to the measurement of PA, diet, and their environments. It's a little complicated. We asked them for like 10-page articles just summarizing the easy way to measure things about diet and physical activity, et cetera. And all of them came back with 50+ pages. And they were complaining that they couldn't write 200 pages. So but that's professors for you, right? No offense. And then brand new that we just helped develop with funding from the JPB Foundation are these 2 to 4 minute training modules that have slides and voiceover narration hitting upon the sort of key topics in measurement. And what happened is we had a series of focus groups, and I had originally thought we should create some learning resources that were, like 120 PowerPoint slides with 3 hours of lecture. But when we did the focus groups, people did not seem to want that. They called for these short, pithy e-learning modules that highlighted the key points. So after a lot of arguing on conference calls, I finally gave in to the crowdsourced information about what our stakeholders might want. And so we developed these modules, and I think those would be really useful for teaching. And we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see, what kind of uptake they have as a resource. So NCORE has a website. Check it out. It has a myriad of interesting resources, and there's a lot of webinars there archived. So it could be a good learning resource and useful to fill in some time in your classes if you've forgotten to prepare a lecture or something. The next tool I want to talk about is this Act 24, which is a 24-hour physical activity recall tool that you can fill out either on your smartphone or on a computer screen. And earlier versions of it have been validated, and they give highly valid measures of energy expenditure if you give multiple 24-hour recalls to people. And the results are correlated with device-based measurements. And there's a long history of time use research suggesting that this 24-hour recall approach, where you work your way through yesterday, say, okay, I woke up at 7, I spent 15 minutes flossing, etc. It really helps improve the measurement of behavior compared to standardized survey estimates. We're excited about this tool, and it's in kind of soft release. You can use it now, but we haven't yet had a formal launch and what have you. And the way it works is you work your way through your day and list your different activities. There's some purpose questions, there's some posture questions depending on the type of activity, and we hope it's going to be a tool to complement some of the other measurement approaches where accelerometers aren't feasible, but where you want a bit more detail about the kinds of behaviors that you're measuring. And there's a research data site, and we're hosting all this at NCI. It's free. We have a multi-year commitment. It has a sister tool, ASA 24, which is similar for recall, a 24-hour dietary recall. We've supported that for 10 years or more. So, hopefully it'll last. There's no guarantees. But anyway, the research team can register the study. Then they can invite participants. The participants fill out their surveys. They're uploaded in a private section for you to analyze. And we think this could be a fantastic tool. We just in the field right now are administering the 24-hour recall twice to 2,000 people from the NORC Amerispeak panel that's quasi-nationally representative. And so we hope that's going to give us a neat baseline of data for comparison with other studies across the country, for comparison with the use of Act 24 in epidemiological cohorts, and hopefully as a baseline for another kind of surveillance of physical activity and walking, like I described in NHIS, but with this different measurement modality, so we can try to triangulate some of our results. So we're going to link it to REDCap, a tool that helps you administer the survey more easily and manage your study. We'll have a hard launch of the website, the US national sample I mentioned. And yeah, you can create a research project and enroll yourself in it and try it out. The journey to good new science begins with enrolling your first subject. The last set of resources I wanted to mention, these metabolic equivalent of tasks. So very often when you ask people what they're doing, you get 30 minutes playing tennis, 60 minutes lying on the couch, and it can be hard to know sort of what to compare between your different people or different groups. So one way to compare different groups is by linking the description of a behavior to a measure of energy expenditure, the MET score, the metabolic equivalent of task. And one of the things we've invested a lot in over the years is different resources to help investigators connect MET scores to various activities. So the classic resource in this area is the Adult Compendium of MET scores, developed by Barbara Ainsworth and a whole bunch of people and managed by Steve Herman. Carlos, I think you may have been involved in this back in the day. And NCI has provided some support at different times for some of the literature reviews there. We've helped lead a team to develop an updated youth compendium of activities, which is hosted at the NCORE website. We've supported work that Katrine Tudor-Locke led and Rick Troiano was instrumental in, linking the American Time Use Survey activity categories to MET scores. I helped a team from the UK with a MET score linkage project with the multinational time use activity categories. And we've just now developed standardized criteria for classifying international activities for time use statistics, activity groups into different intensity categories. So we're really investing in this because we think this is a valuable resource for investigators. And these kinds of tools, it's hard to get a grant to do this kind of work. So you have to sort of cobble together different organizations, tidbits of money, institutional support to create these things that end up having a big impact. And it's worth it to support your young professors and what have you doing some of this work because, for example, it leads to papers about the adult compendium that end up getting cited thousands and thousands of times. So this can be influential work. I'm going to, should I stop or keep flapping my lips?
9 minutes.
9 minutes?
Questions, if anybody wants to.
Okay, so let me just come to the very end, and then I'll open it up for questions, right? I'm skipping over this funding material. Check out the slides and download this, and you can see me. If you loved me, I'm online in a video for the second International Electronic Conference on Environmental Health Sciences. I believe in this video I'm wearing exactly the same tie, my lucky presentation tie, and this is an address, Putting Cancer in Its Place, Geospatial Approaches to Cancer Control and Population Sciences. So some intersection with this work on transportation and neighborhood, but extending to a number of other topics. We're having another convening on health and active transportation, December 11th and 12th. I think Jennifer might be coming. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to try to spend a day and a half and come up with a roadmap for research on transportation and health for the next decade, very efficiently. So I'm counting on you, Jennifer. And so in conclusion, and sort of what's needed next, I mean, I think we do need to continue to advance this body of evidence supporting the benefits of specific interventions and policies. We need to really focus on addressing inequities in the environment and behavior, because that's the origin of health disparities, or these inequities in environment and behavior, and we need to grapple with them more. We've been talking about it, but how do we make more progress? We need to figure out, I think, how to sequence policy change for steady health behavior gains. It's easy to imagine sort of a beautiful city and how fabulous everything would be, and a terrible city and how messed up everything is. But how do we get there in a series of steps, each of which alone doesn't, fix everything, but shows progress and support and lets policymakers work towards each step. Rigorous evaluation of behavioral consequences of transportation programs and policy. There's some work that we're funding in that, but I think more is needed there. One thing that I think may exist, but I'm having a hard time getting it, are national transportation-related data layers for linkage with epidemiological cohorts. Where can I go to just download, characteristics of every county in terms of transportation? You can send me an email. And probably more granular data are needed in many counties. So, and addressing physical activity, time use, walking, and transportation over the whole 24-hour day. Because, as I said, I think it's really important to think about substitution and about how changes in one aspect of your life influence all the other different aspects. And the amount of time you sleep, the amount of time you sit, the amount of time you move, all matter for health and are interconnected with each other. So, thanks.
I have two questions, but the second kind of a follow-up to the first.
Okay.
So the first is, you might have said it, but I might have missed it, was what is the, do you have like an estimated timeline of when that ACT 24 gets launched?
It's ready now to use. We just don't have a formal website. So get the slides from Teresa, and on slide 37, you'll see two links, the researcher site and the participant site. Yeah. Just go to the researcher site, click it, fill out the registration form, name your study, and you can try it out and see if it might serve your interests or your project or what have you.
The slides will be available through our website, although they will be saved as PDFs. So you might have to copy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question about second inclusion with inequities and how it might connect to your weather study and whether you consider urban canopy, percentage of the city's urban canopy and its impact on walking, especially in the Sun Belt region. In particular, in Los Angeles, that's a huge problem. Creating your own shade structures is illegal. They get taken down, you get fined, and a lot of the trees are not shade. They're not shade trees. They're palm trees. And so the heat and the impact on the elderly and the homeless, and not having urban canopy.
Yeah, no, we haven't yet done any analyses there, but obviously we're talking about it because it makes perfect sense. And so that's a beautiful opportunity for a project proposal and some analysis. And I know some cities are beginning to develop data layers that have all the trees. Each tree has an email address in some of the cities. And so I think that's a fabulous thing and clearly a topic area that people are starting to talk about from an equity standpoint. I was telling some people in a meeting earlier, one of my favorite news studies is occurring in Louisville, where a heart disease researcher is interested in pollution exposure and how the tree canopy might influence pollution exposure. And he has this amazing study, the Green Louisville study, where he's measured pollution exposure, and then the Nature Conservancy is planting 10,000 plus mature trees, and then he's going to, now you have a tree canopy. And some of the neighborhoods he's looking at are historically deprived neighborhoods that had really inadequate tree cover. So then he's going to go back and measure pollution exposure. So that seems like a beautiful, evaluation of a natural experiment. And I imagine that's the sort of experiment that he could also go on to look at some of the heat and sun exposure characteristics. So no, I'm very excited about that green nature exposure and health area from a lot of different dimensions. And I think it's beginning to gain a little traction, even in the biomedical establishment. I went to a conference in Houston at the Children's Hospital, and they were talking about green elements in hospital rooms, green elements in rooftop gardens, and green elements across the neighborhoods of Houston. So there's, a really exciting area.
So from like the planning side, we're probably more likely to pay attention to transportation walking as opposed to leisure walking. Do you find that there's kind of like diminishing returns based on the amount of leisure walking that people are likely to do, right? If you give like infinite possibilities in parks and leisure-based bike paths, people aren't going to spend all of their 24 hours on them, but are they more likely to spend more time doing walking for transportation, given more opportunities for walking for transportation, as opposed to like kind of that same proportion of like, do you see what I'm saying? The relative bang for your buck of leisure walking versus, or opportunities for leisure walking versus opportunities for transportation walking?
Yeah, no, that's a really good and really complicated question. And I think I don't know the answer to that or how to even think about exactly answering it, because it involves sort of assessing interventions, policies, and programs and kind of working out their, population level influences. What I think I'm at a much more, primitive stage of where we've been spending a lot of time sort of trying to show that, like I said, that light activity is good for you and moderate, and you can, if you do enough light activity, it can deliver the same value that moderate activity. But trying to tease apart sort of activity in different functional categories and thinking about the benefits at the economic or community or health level of those different things. Ooh, that's the work of a lifetime, right? So I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, maybe someone else in the room has a good answer.
No, I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's a good question as
Yeah.
trade-offs of people's time. Gives us the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's another good lens of thinking of it. Finish your PhD, apply for the Cancer Prevention Fellowship, and come work with me.
in your measurement tools or your measurement data, do you take into consideration people whose jobs require a lot of walking, like factory workers, machinists, automotive repair folks, or is it strictly leisure and incidental walking?
Yeah, so we're in this period of the questions about transportation don't mention occupation. So that's a little bit confusing. Do people count, if it's part of their job, are they thinking that's transportation walking, or do they think it's just job work? The American Time Use Survey was originally conceived of to kind of look at non-work activities. The economists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were especially concerned about estimating how much unpaid work there was in the economy and what its benefits were. So they curiously ask a ton about what you're doing outside of work, but it's like when you're at work, it's just sort of work. And historically, I think the physical activity field had focused a lot on this idea that, I think it was a bit of bias. It's like white collar workers who need to jog 30 minutes a day so they won't have a heart attack, and didn't really think very carefully about the full spectrum of human behavior and human work. Now there's a little bit of a literature emerging about whether or not occupational activity has the same relationship to health outcomes as leisure time or transportation activity. And people are starting to try to analyze cohorts and separate the effects. And some of those studies have suggested that maybe occupational activity isn't so good for you, perhaps because it's stressful, or there's a lot of it, or there's some kind of interaction with the way you imagine the activity as being sort of required. But I don't think that epidemiology is really well worked out yet, in part because of the inadequate measurement. So I think that's just a fascinating area right now that we need better data resources to try to tease apart. In a way, it's related to the differential contribution of different kinds of activities. So we need a little bit of more data, but also just a little bit more thinking, review, and coming up with conceptual models of how the different activity types might contribute to health. So great question.
There's a guy in Amsterdam, Willem, and he's got identified multiple cohorts that have differentiated occupation and leisure time and transportation physical activity, and then he's put them all in one place and assess. And I think that HIS 1993 might have differentiated occupational and leisure time, I think.
Neat. Yeah, so I think that's a neat area and of global importance too. The US still has a lot of physically demanding work, but the proportion has changed over the years. But worldwide, such a key public health challenge. And related to equity as well, because of the, SES gradients in the type of work people do.
That's great. I put about 10,000 steps a day at work. So
yeah.
Time I get home, later walking, like,
Yeah, and I can't believe that clearly all walking at work can't be neutral or bad for you. So, but kind of working it out, because it's occurring under different circumstances and in different volumes and what have you.
Well, your metabolic rate doesn't really increase to the point where you're talking about beneficial, based on what we're thinking as like leisure walking or transportation walking, we're walking briskly.
Yeah.
So being active all day long, we don't know the correlation between that and the correlation of 30-minute brisk walking.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of the studies now are suggesting that compared to sort of very little activity, light intensity physical activity adds up to provide substantial benefits. But some of those studies are in older people where it's a little hard to tease apart the exact causality, because maybe if you have very low activity, you might have some pre-existing conditions. So but it sure does look like that compared to nothing, light intensity activity adds up to be good for you as well. But then for different health outcomes, there can be different relationships too. So if you start to stratify by cancer at different sites, by cardiovascular disease, by diabetes, there may be some differential distributions of light, moderate, and vigorous physical activity in terms of the magnitude of their benefits. Okay. Sure.